Welcome, everybody. We've got a bit of a treat for you today. We've got a couple guests here. This, obviously, you know, it's me, you know, Jordan. We've been doing this a few times. We have Lionel King from Bon Vita Wines here, helping us out and facilitating all this. And we have Silvia Altare joining us. So welcome, Silvia. Thanks for joining us today, taking your time out of your very busy schedule.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about, let's introduce yourself. Talk a little bit about yourself and maybe about your history.
So, Silvia, I'm talking to you from my office in Barolo. The winery is in La Morra. Winery is Elio Altare. Elio is my dad. And I'm pretty relaxed, even if I just had a baby, so I won't be relaxed probably for the next 20 years, but I'm relaxed because we just finished harvest. We got the last grapes in on Wednesday. And it's been a good one. Just so you know, you'll have more good wines to sell. So the history of my winery, I always joke and say it's kind of boring because my family has a history very similar to many other farms around here in Barolo. So my grandparents and my ancestors used to sell grapes to the negociants, to the cooperatives, to the big coop that were just buying bulk wine or grapes. My dad was the first one to officially turn it into a business where the wine was in bottle. So grandpa made a little bit of wine in bottle, but it was pretty bad. So we don't calculate that. So I'm officially just second generation, but my father has a big, strong personality for what he has done and what he is. He was one of the rebels that did what's called today the Revolution of Barolo. So probably you guys have heard this story a million times, and you've heard the fights and the stories about the modernists and the traditionalists. What I always like to say is that it wasn't just about winemaking, or at least for my family, what it was about. My dad and his friends were trying they were looking forward to have a better life, because their life back then was pretty miserable. Being a winemaker today, it's cool. You make conference calls with Canada and you travel the world. My dad, when he was in his 20s, he could not find a wife because he was a farmer. So being a farmer in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s wasn't as cool as it is today. So when the Revolution of Barolo came, it wasn't just about changing the style of winemaking, the approach in the vineyards, but it was really a drastic change of lifestyle. And that's always what I try to tell people. And my dad was really pushing on this, because he said his life was shitty. I mean, he had to knock on, the negociant's doors to buy the grapes. The negociant would say, we take your grapes. No, we don't take them. And if they took them, they would pay him after a year. So it was just like always living on a very thin line of where his life was depending on, it was on the, you say that in English, in the hands of someone else. He was not deciding for himself. And things suddenly changed after his first trip he took to Burgundy in 1976. So my dad is from 50, so he was only 26. Until that moment, he sold most of his grapes to the negociant, to the cooperative. And then in 76, he went to France and he got to meet some simple, humble people like Hubert de Villaine or Michel Lafarge or Imet Dujac and, Philippe Angel from René Angel. So these cool guys that were, some of them his age, that were already rock stars back then. They were proud of what they had, while my dad was embarrassed to tell girls he was a farmer. So, and he always says, you see, what pushed me to change, it wasn't just wine, it was also women. Okay, so women played an important role. But apart from the funny jokes, what those guys did, it was something that they had the right idea at the right time in history, and it's something that it's hard to replicate. That would be hard to replicate today. So they started changing, things in the vineyards, in the cellar. I don't know how deep you want to get into the details, and probably you already know the story, but definitely my dad was the godfather of this group. he was young. I mean, some of the kids that followed him were even younger. So, and that's how the Barolo Boys were born in the early, let's say mid 80s, early 80s. I mean, it's history. You watched the documentaries, you read about this, but what doesn't change is that those guys were driven by strong passion, and they wanted to change the world. And I think somehow they did it, because Barolo is definitely, I mean, on a wine map today, and it was not on a wine map, 50, 60 years ago.
Right.
So I'm sure you've had some old vintages of Barolo. I've had some old vintages. Sometimes you get there's some really good stuff. There were exceptions. I've had great wines from the Conterno, from the Gaias, from the Rinaldi, from the Mascarellos. But how many great wineries were making great wines back then? Very few. Most of the wine was made and managed by the cooperatives. My grandfather's wine is still terrible today after 60 years. My grandpa used to say, I remember this, my dad always tells me, grandpa would sell a bottle to a customer and say, Barolo needs time. You have to wait 20 years, 30 years. You know what? My grandpa was off of 60 years because his wines are still undrinkable today. But so it's a combination of a lot of things. They wanted to change their life, and they wanted to make a wine that people could drink and that it could sell. And it's just a chain of reaction. And look where we are today. Barolo has about 600 wineries. Wow. So it worked.
So how, like, just out of curiosity, how many wineries were there back in, say, the early 70s when your dad was just sort of getting started?
I'm going to say, well, I can give you the exact numbers. In La Morra, there were 5 wineries officially, like 5 wineries that had a license to bottle. Everyone else was selling the grapes. I mean, we always had vineyards here. The Romans planted vineyards 1,000 years ago. So, but who had a license, who had a label back then? When in La Morra, it was about 5. In total in the area, I'm going to say maybe 20, maybe 30. But most of the people were selling the grapes. That's it. There was no business. There was no future. There was no interest in making bottling wine. So
I think it's interesting because even the wineries that would have been more reluctant to modernize or to be dragged kicking and screaming into the modern era, they've reaped the benefits too, though, because Barolo is now a name. So they might have resisted the change, but they're selling their wines for, it's not like they kept their wines really cheap.
Yes, the name we mentioned earlier, now they're the most expensive wines. So, but this is the good part of the revolution. It's very hard to distinct maybe at the beginning the distinction was more clear, but then the line got a little more blurry, and everybody benefited from each other. So yeah. I mean, now I always use a few examples, and I make names because they're obvious to everyone. Let's say you visit Giacomo Conterno, Roberto, from the Monfortino producer. He's got the most immaculate and technological winery that you'll ever see. He has a beautiful winery. Think of the most futuristic equipment, he has it. But he's considered traditionalist. So what? So you see, the styles are mixing so much. Do you think Maria Teresa Mascarello from Bartolo has chickens running around the cellar? I don't think so. So the cellar is perfect. So it's the line between the two styles. It's more about a blah blah than the style is definitely mixing. Yeah.
Well, that was definitely one of our questions. That the two camps are a lot more intertwined these days than you might think. But just for the benefit of the people that will be watching later, I mean, Simon and I and Lionel, we all know kind of what the difference was between more kind of traditional and modern Barolo attitudes. Could you tell us just a few of the technical differences that people like your father did to modernize Barolo?
Yeah, so starting from the vineyard, which is the main point, I would say reduce the use of chemicals and pesticides. My grandfather was #1 user of fertilizers and pesticides, so organic farming. I always joke and say, when people say, are you organic? Are you biological? Are you natural? I'm like, yes, but it's not a news. My dad was organic already like 50 years ago. So organic, dropping fruit in order to have healthier and better fruit, so better wine. My grandpa, again, if he could, he would have attached more grapes to the vines. While my dad started dropping, they started dropping fruit. They cleaned their cellars. Grandpa had probably washed his equipment once a year, and he had chickens running around. Clean cellar. Oh, sorry, my office phone is ringing. Sorry. Clean cellar, clean equipment, shorter maceration. Grandpa was macerating about, sorry, I'm gonna take this off. Was macerating about 60 days, 90 days, and the wines were harsh and tannic and austere and serious, still undrinkable today. I have evidence in the library, so shorter maceration and aging. They moved from the big botti. They started experimenting with the barrique, with the French oak. And this is this is basically the macro, you say macro rules, I would say. Then there's a lot of little details. But it's interesting when people describe the revolution, they always focus on barriques and they think it was just one thing. No, there were a lot of things that were changed along the way. So barrique is just one of them. And what's interesting, for me, some of my favorite wines, for example, today are made in big botti. But the big botti of today, they're not the botti of my grandfather that were, washed once every 5 years. Again, go to Maria Teresa Mascarello or to Giuseppe Rinaldi, they clean their equipment. So it's all a matter of hygiene, technology, and using common sense. Maybe back then they were not really winemakers, they were just farmers. That was just one of the things they did, so.
I feel like in our region, in the Okanagan, you get a lot of that too, where it's not our region in British Columbia. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's a fairly young region. It really only goes back about 30 maybe 40 years if you're really old school. But same idea, right? There's a lot of farmers that are farmers first, winemakers second kind of thing. And over years, it's kind of been a guess and test kind of thing where people have learned some things. Maybe we can plant this, maybe we shouldn't plant this type of thing. But yeah, no, I completely understand what you mean. It's not like fine wine and the elevated winemaking that we see like places like Burgundy or Bordeaux or something like that. That's a lot of years of tradition. Figuring things out.
400 years, exactly. So we're babies.
Yeah. Describe for me the difference in the wine. You mentioned the tannin, but what are some of the other differences between like the old classic Barolo versus contemporary Barolo, at least in terms of in the glass?
So these are really stereotypes, because I can give you an example. Last night I had 2 great bottles of wine. I was a little drunk back then, but at that point, but I had a Rinaldi 05, which I could have mistaken for a modern wine, and I had a Conterno Cascina Francia 2011. I was already drunk back then, so that doesn't count. I can't describe that one. But if you go back in the past, definitely the modern wines were darker, richer, more like sweeter, and the color was more, vibrant, and the tannins more approachable and fresher fruit. The traditionalists back then were lighter in color, more, madderized, brown, the brown edge on the glass, a little bit drier tannins. But this is, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Today, sometimes I get confused. I mean, another example, I recently had the entry-level Maria Teresa Barolo Mascarello 2016. It's so smooth. Oh my God, I wanted to drink it like this. So it's far away from the description of harsh and dry and no. So these were somehow stereotypes that also, I'm going to say, the press and the writers liked to play with, to create almost like the 2 parliaments of wine, the conservative and the progressist. And so, but today, it's not so obvious. Yeah.
There's a lot of swing voters.
Yeah.
Do you think a lot of the winemakers from both camps have kind of started to meet in the middle a bit? Like, do you think over the course of the last 35, 40 years that some people are like, you know what, maybe they have a point. Maybe if we're only yielding say 3 tons or 2.5 tons an acre instead of going for 6 and 7. Maybe they got something right there, or maybe like, you know, we're going to macerate for like, you know, 4 or 5 days instead of 18 days. Like, you know, with that, you know, people starting to rethink their idea? Or is there some really stubborn people that are just like, no, I'm in my camp?
I think it's very subjective. If you like what you do, which I like the wines of my dad when I taste his wines from the library, and I think they're, last night, among the many bottles we drank Calarigi, which are a single vineyard Barbera 99. I mean, that wine was so fresh, and that wine is macerated 3 days on the skins, and it sees 18 months of new oak. But well, after 20 years, the oak was completely integrated. So you see, I think it's very subjective when you like what you do, when you see, when you're lucky to see the evolution of the wines, and the wines can last in time and all this. I'm sticking to what I've learned because I like it. But no one says, there's no rule that says, oh, you can't change. So that's the beauty. We all change. New generation brings in new idea, new technology, new approach. I don't see this as a negative thing. Thank God the world moves on. Otherwise, we would still, you know, riding horses instead of Tesla. So it's just that it's very subjective. What's interesting, most of the Barolo boys, the winemakers that started with my dad in the 80s, are the new generation. So they're the sons and the daughters are either kind of stepping back or mixing styles. We're one of the few that still only use French oak. And when people say, oh, when are you going to change? And I'm like, what do you mean? Do I have to change? I like my wines. I've tasted so many old vintages and I'm happy with them. Customers are happy. Maybe ask me in 20 years. Right now, I'm happy with where we are.
Right.
So
I got you. All right. In that regard, then, if it almost sounds to me like the new generation almost is sort of like, you know, when the generation before it seems very rebellious, the next generation almost seems anti-rebellious because it's sort of like you took our rebellion and like, hey, just keep going with it. But like, no, we like traditionalism. We're gonna go back, and you know, like it's sort of like hipster mentality, right? What's old is cool, and what's new is not cool. So,
but I think you just have to find your own path. So
right. Where does I guess because of your dad, and I've seen the Barolo Boys documentary. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's really an interesting documentary, not only about wine, but anyone who's ever wanted to start a movement and sort of like, you know, wanted to change things. And it's sort of interesting to me because one of the things I learned from the documentary is that it was very much, it was contentious. Like how can maybe like even between him and his father, like to the point that, I don't know whether he was actually kidding or not, but he was saying that at one point, like his father disowned him, and he was, you know, and basically like, you're ruining our family legacy, you're ruining the winery, you're ruining it, and you're, you know, like maybe speak to that a little bit.
It's all true, but also we're talking about a different, you say era, different time. Yeah. I know it's only 50, 60 years ago, but back then the father was the boss. There was no margin of discussion, and you had to, it's not like today I say I run the winery now and I'm a woman, so but I had to earn my position, which I guess I did, but my dad had to wait for his father to die in order to, either he waited for his father to die or he did what he did because he just went against the rules. So there was no freedom, I'm sorry, I'm gonna take off the phone from the, whatever it's called, otherwise it's gonna keep ringing. 1 second.
All good.
Nobody ever calls me, they're calling me now. Sorry.
All good.
But it's interesting that my dad got disowned by his dad, and many of the winemakers that he started with have a very similar story. Like they were not getting along with the parents because the parents saw their action as an insult, like you're cutting grapes, oh, you're wasting food, God will punish you. Right. Or my dad chopping the big botti, the big vats that my great-great-grandfather had built, that was an insult to the heritage of the family. And why would you buy French oak? Or pushing the chickens out. No, the chickens have to sleep outside. So, you know, everything was taken very personal.
That's hilarious.
But today, I don't say it's easy because it's always a challenge when you work with family. I don't know if you guys work with family, but it's always challenging. But I'm a woman. I've learned my way with my dad. I always make him think that he had the idea, but instead it was me putting the idea in his head and all stuff like that. So I do those tricks.
Just out of curiosity, did your grandfather ever get to taste your dad's wines?
No, because when my dad started experimenting, 76, 77, grandpa died in 85. So for about 10 years, they didn't speak to each other.
Oh, so they never really reconciled or anything like that.
He died, my grandpa died convinced that Elio was stupid or crazy, that he had ruined everything. My grandma died only in 2000, so she saw what happened. She saw the evolution, the revolution. She tasted the wines, and that's a very sensitive part of my family, of the story of my family. I remember she died at home, and she apologized before dying to my dad. So she saw it, but Grandpa died thinking that my dad was just crazy. Yeah. And my dad always says that he has very few regrets in life, but he thinks his father died. I don't know the word in English, because he thinks his father died because of, he was so sad that he—
A broken heart?
Yeah, he made him die. He killed him. That's what Ellie always says. It's sad. Yeah. But look what he achieved. So I always tell him, Elio, don't make me die. Let me do my things, and I won't make you die. So, no, we work together very well, and I have a very good team today. So I'm very happy. I got rid of all my dad's, oh my God, 120 years old employees. Now I have staff that is all my age. It's good. It's good. I'm happy.
Well, how many bottles are you producing over at Elio Altare?
It's the same as it was in the past, about 10 hectares. I always say 60 to 80,000 bottles. My peak was in 2004, 80,000, but then it's usually 60, 70,000. Yeah. I mean, that's what you get with 10 hectares, more or less. Yeah.
So you've never expanded or anything like that, or has it always been just a small family?
No. My dad always said, you know, if you want to start making more wine, get more land, or you know what, I rather stay small. I have control on everything that happens. I mean, we're not just I'm just not just sitting in the office. I go in the vineyards, in the cellar, I look after the sales. I mean, I have working at Altare full time, I have 6 people plus me, 7. I don't hire any seasonal workers. It's just us. Even through harvest, oh my God, my guys work. And this year I couldn't harvest because I had the baby, but they work 20 hours a day. But we made the choice to stay small. And instead of making more bottles to make more wine, what I do, I just raise the price every year. And I work the same.
Genius.
Problem solved.
Fatto.
Can I ask a question?
The only thing I would like to maybe change, and maybe it's now a little too late. My dad always worked these 10 hectares, of which 5 were property and 5 were rented. Now I was able to buy 2 hectares, so I own 7. I'm still renting 3. I'm trying to buy these rented vineyards that my dad farmed like already 40 years ago, but now the land is so expensive. I mean, I have to sell my house to buy a piece of land. It's just stupid these days. Yeah.
Good. Go ahead, Lyle. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you know, if you've implemented any changes at the winery since you've kind of taken over running, any changes that you might have made. Curious.
I always say that technology, oh my God, what is it? Sorry, phone keeps ringing. I don't know how to turn it. Technology plays a big role. So I use technology that my dad doesn't know. So for example, we bought a new crusher a few years ago. You know, the crusher that can leave your, I don't have the super duper technological expensive one, but I have a very good one that leaves the berries full and takes off all the stems. because my dad's crusher from 1978 was a little old, so we got rid of that one. I bought new pumps, and these are all details that customers don't really see, but you know, at the end probably has an impact on the wine. This is funny. I got for Christmas some years ago from my dad, because he still goes in the vineyards and checks. Do you say in English refractometer, that you put refractometro? Because he used to just go taste and just guess. He was all into guessing, or he would, you know, take some berries home and make some juice and measure with a thermometer. It's called densimetro. I don't know that word in English, but it's good. But it's also, you want to go in the vineyard, just look at that thing. So my dad, the first year that we got him that for Christmas, he had it in his pocket always, and he carried it like a gun. You know, I was like, I got this, so technological. But I didn't tell him that when I worked 20 years ago in Australia, we already used that. But he thinks it's the coolest thing ever. So little things. I'm still using the same oak. I've introduced different oak, but still the same size, French barriques. And there's one thing I always joke about. I'm super organized. My dad was an Italian man, very messy. I'm very precise and organized. So
that's hilarious. I can see him as a refractometer, thinking to myself, it's like you pulled out some black magic or something, like, you know.
I'm like, I mean, I worked in Australia in 2001. I worked in California, and I'm like, Dad, yeah, it's for you. It's special.
We're not guessing what 23 bricks looks like anymore. Just like,
no.
I think for the lot of wine regions, though, I think that's sort of a thing where, whether it be Barolo or other places, where that's sort of was the delineated from change of era, is almost that adoption of technology, right? Like, you know, like you say, like, we kind of laugh about it. And I mean, I think there is something to be said for wines that are a little bit too modern, a little bit too precise, a little bit too, there needs to be some artistry involved for sure.
Absolutely.
But I think on the flip side of that coin too, you definitely have an embracing of technology. And I've heard it said too, that the gap in good wine and bad wine, not only in one region, but around the world, has really shrank quite a bit because of the sharing of technology, right? You've got, you know, people are sharing ideas, what works in the vineyard, what works in the cellar, what works in terms of blending. So I think, to me, that's sort of a big thing, whether you're in Bordeaux or whether you're in Chile or maybe some new and emerging region like China or wherever. Like, there's definitely people are almost starting to sit on a level playing. It's almost much more of a level playing field.
Certo. Can I tell you one more silly story about my dad that you're not going to share with anyone, right?
Please do.
We won't share it with anyone.
Yeah, this is good.
Promise.
Funny, because we're talking about the man that within his group, with his friends, with the Barolo Boys, they invented rotary fermenters, and they had all these, you know, crazy equipment back in the 90s. But then my dad, until I'm gonna say 5 years ago, he had a cell phone that was like 2 pounds, and you know the cell phone that you open like this. It was called StarTAC. I don't know in English. Yeah. But so finally we got him a phone, like an Android, where he could check, because we downloaded the weather apps. So you could predict the future for the weather, because my dad would go outside on the terrace and say, Silvia, you see the birds are flying east and the ducks are flying low and the ants are moving towards west. It's going to rain tomorrow. What is this? So I pull out my phone and I said, look, Dad, it's not going to rain tomorrow. So we finally got him a phone. So he has weather apps now.
That's awesome. This is one of these days I have to meet this man. He sounds absolutely fascinating. Reminds me of my dad, actually.
Silvia, I was wondering if you could speak to the idea. In our part of the world, we perhaps consume a little too much wine press. You know, we listen to critics a lot, and I often find that sometimes a vintage will come along. And you know, it's more challenging, and everyone tries their best to make their best wine. But because the wine press says, you know what, don't drink 2014 or don't drink 2011, that everyone just avoids it, whether or not they've even tried it. And I was wondering if you could speak to the idea of what happens during a so-called off vintage. Like, I'm a huge fan of Barolos from 2011. I think they're
Oh, yeah.
amazing, and I think they're drinking beautifully right now. I had one earlier this week. But I was wondering if you could just speak to the idea of vintages, because I try to impress upon people that good people make good wine, no matter when.
Yes, I agree. So I also have a very, obviously I believe that journalists help. If the Barolo Boys and Barolo has had a renaissance, it's also because a lot of writers were writing about it. So we can't say, oh, Galoni doesn't help, Wine Spectator doesn't help. It helps. But I believe that in my case, we're so small that I wish that my customers were my customers forever, not just because they follow the points. So as soon as the points are released, when you get hundreds of emails, we want to buy 1,000 bottles of your Barolo Canubi. Well, I only make 1,200 and you can get an allocation of 3 bottles, whatever. But so I want customers that love Altare or love blah, blah, whoever, because they follow the winemaker. And I think a serious winemaker does his best even in challenging vintages. I'll give you an example. For us, 2002 for Piemonte was very, very difficult. We had a lot of rain, we had hail. At Altare in 2002, I had just joined the company back then. I remember we harvested, we made the wine, and then we were tasting and retasting. And my dad was always thinking, we were saying, what do you think? Do we like the wine? You know what? We ended up making the wine and selling everything in bulk to the negociant because we thought we didn't want to cheat on our customers. So 2002 Altare was not released. Vintages like 2011, personally, I love.
Yeah, me too.
Very good.
I think they're fantastic.
2014, very challenging. The prices would be like 14. I even made a Riserva. We made Barolo Riserva in 2014 because I believe that I worked really hard and I've tasted that wine a million times and I think it's awesome. So it's all about how serious you are and you have to know what's behind the label. I'm sorry, I don't want customers that just read the books. I want customers that drink and know and follow the history and all that. Yeah. But vintages, I mean, every year is so different. Like this year it started great. Then we were scared it was going to rain. And all the weather apps we had on the phone, even my dad, they were all wrong. It didn't really rain. So we've had another great vintage. It's obviously harder to make mistakes when the vintage is good. But I think you see a great winemaker in challenging vintages. So
for sure, absolutely. Hey, when it didn't rain, did your dad say, "Oh, we should have listened to the ducks and the ants and the birds"?
To the birds. I told you, please, yeah.
That's hilarious.
I could just make a conference just about stories about family and my dad. There's so many bad jokes. Sorry.
Speak to a little bit. I guess before the Barolo revolution, as we call it, Barolo generally export-wise, or even I imagine within Italy, was not seen as much. It wasn't a famous wine like it is now outside of the region. And obviously, over the last 35 years, Barolo has become a major, I think, a sophisticated element of the wine industry. How does that feel like? Growing up in Piedmont and seeing like, well, Barolo used to be sort of a bulk wine kind of thing. Back in the old days, it used to be a sweet wine, and now we are one of the premier regions of Italy.
I mean, there was someone exporting. I mean, if you think the Gaia family, the Conterno, those guys, but they were the exception, right? If I think where we sell the wine today, we have a pin on the map almost all over the world. It's just crazy. And there's places, can I give you one example? And I could send you evidence of an email that I got yesterday from an importer from Jordania.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, Jordan, I had to look in a map. Jordan here. And I wrote the guy, oh, thank you. We're honored you want to start working with us. By the way, I thought Jordan was a little bit Muslim. So do you guys really you have a market for alcohol? And the guy wrote me back, when the doors are closed, nobody's Muslim anymore. Okay, good. So we're gonna start shipping to Jordan now. So all over the world, Barolo is I'm gonna say it's famous today, and it's still small. the whole appellation makes, last year where we declared 14 million bottles, which is what Moët Chandon bottles in like six, I don't know, in a month. So the region is still very small. It's still a very special wine, I'm going to say, but it is sold all over the world. And it's an honor to see people that want to come and visit from all over the world. My dad, he always tells me that when he started the business, he would leave the door open to the winery and to the tasting room, hoping for people to drive by so they could see the door open, that they would come in. Now, if I don't lock myself in, people just walk into my kitchen. It's just people come all the time. Christmas Day, Sunday, you have to lock yourself in. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. With that, like being a global wine, like you had alluded to, is there a pressure, do you think, to sort of be charging those premium of the world prices? Because I think one of the things I love about Barolo is that it's a wine that's obviously, whether you're modern or traditional, whatever, obviously it's a wine that's got longevity in its bones for sure. But if you look at, I think if you look at other wines, sort of of that caliber, the wines that you can save for many, many years, usually they have prices that are a little bit higher. But I've always found, and Jordan and I have had these discussions before, where if you look at like other regions, like whether it be Bordeaux or Burgundy or, Napa Valley, a lot of their top offerings are really in that sort of stratosphere of price. But I feel like Barolo doesn't really get there. Like, I mean, like even the most expensive of Barolo is not quite that sort of price of Lafite or Screaming Eagle or Penfolds Grange even. Do you think that Barolo eventually will get to that point, or is it sort of?
I hope not. I'm a drinker, so I'm already scared of like some of the famous traditionalists that used to pay 25 euros. Now they're like 150. So I'm already scared of that. But it's nothing compared to, obviously, as you said, Bordeaux and Burgundy. I believe there's a lot of speculation right now. Up to today, the most expensive Italian wine is not Masseto anymore, but is Monfortino.
Oh, really?
Which is, yeah, I'm very proud of it. I mean, it's a Barolo, great. It's not Tuscan wine anymore. But if you think about it, it's averagely sold in Italy for 800 to 1,000 euros a bottle, which is expensive, but the guy makes nothing. I don't know how many bottles, but I don't think he makes millions. So it's a small production anyway, and it's something very special. So, but he's the exception. You can drink great wines for 30, 40 bucks. It's fine. You don't have to spend hundreds. I mean, so, but where it's going, I don't know. Let's talk about this in 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there a lot of vineyard to expand the region of Barolo? Is it something that is, or is it kind of like Burgundy, where it's kind of like at this point we need someone to pass away or want to sell the farm and start a polka band or something like that in order to get more vineyard?
Well, physically we can expand the region. The borders are closed. We've been expanding within the region and planting also maybe an area where my grandparents would have planted woods and hazelnuts, but there's always farms for sale. But obviously the price of land has gone up. I mean, I can give you some numbers. Canubi, which is probably the most historic, famous vineyard we have in the region. It's our Grand Cru. It sells, we say in Italiano, you go blind. I mean, you can't just say, oh, I give you this. The last price, it was sold for 6 million per hectare.
Holy.
Which is not close to Burgundy, but very close to Burgundy. It's like Napa expensive pricing. Then you can still find a simple, maybe more not so famous village, like an entry-level Cru Barolo for 1 million, but still that's expensive. So my dad, when he started the business, he would find rents and he would pay the rents or the vineyards he purchased by like, shake my hand, buddy, I'll pay you dinner. That's how he made deals 40 years ago. Now, the deal is not like this anymore. The deal is like, yes, I need a check.
Yeah, right. Let's bring my lawyer into the room and let's just make sure it's all, that kind of money. No kidding.
But we're starting to see investors from outside, foreigners, and we don't have any regulations about that. So basically, who has more money comes in. It doesn't matter if it's American or French or. So we do have some foreigners now in the region that have been investing. Yeah.
How are foreigners viewed?
Next question.
Yeah, that's a contentious question. I'm sure. I know in France they're not very well liked.
I mean, what can I say? I'm sure they put all their love and hire the best, probably winemaker, the best cellar master, the best. But you know, you're always someone that maybe was selling potatoes in Russia, I don't know, and now you're investing in grapes, in wine, and next year you're gonna invest in Brazil in coffee. I don't know, whatever. I mean, they're driven by passion, but to me, I'm sorry to say, it takes away the chance for the locals, for my generation to, yeah, and he's rising the pricing up. So I'm not, that's a little bit of a challenge we're facing now, the foreigners with a lot of money. Yeah.
In places like Oregon and well, even here in BC and Napa, you have now where in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, somebody bought and established a winery, but now their kids don't want to take it over. And so a lot of the time they're selling simply because the kids don't want to farm. Are you seeing the same kind of thing in that region there, where the generation that would take the family estate isn't?
Well, I want to say that you mean, I'm not sure I understood, but you mean the people, that the investors, or the locals? I mean, the locals, all the new generation is staying. I mean, that's why there's a boom of new wineries. Yeah. But in La Mora, I told you there were 5 wineries in the 70s. Now we're 90 wineries. And sometimes I go the wine store in town and I'm like, I've never seen these labels. Oh, he's the cousin of the nephew of the Giovanni Giuseppe. Okay, good. He started a winery. Good. So I got 89 competitors in my town. But no, there's
many with the same last name.
Oh, I'm the only one called Altare. Thank God. Thank God I'm not Mascarello Conterno. Jeez, there's like 100 of those.
There's a lot of Conternos, yeah.
Yeah. But today what's interesting to be a winemaker, it's kind of, I'm proud, obviously, and I feel it's cool. You know, you walk into a room, and I'm gonna say sometimes you feel like a rock star. Oh, the winemaker is coming. My dad, again, his stories, he couldn't find a wife. I tell you a story about my dad's and his jokes. He always says he would go to the disco club in Alba when he was around 20. There was this little dancing club, and they were hunting for women to marry because, you know, farmers had to marry young so they would have kids. That's how it was in Italy, only, 50, 60 years ago. So whenever the girls would, they would start talking, what's your name? How old are you? Where are you from? And then the question was, what do you do? Are you a lawyer? Are you a doctor? Do you work in a bank? Okay, then I'll dance with you and I'll marry you. Are you a farmer? No, thank you. So it's crazy. So things have changed. In the new generation, I'm sure the appealing, it's very appealing, the glamour. And, there's a lot of money that comes in, obviously. It's not the shitty life that my grandparents had. We just have to be careful not to go over the edge and become too cool or too glamorous. That's what I'm scared of too.
Great. I know I promised we'd keep this short, and we've already gone almost an hour. And I know I have this feeling that someday if we ever had a dinner together, we'd be at that dinner table for about 5 hours. Like we would just talk.
Make sure you have at least a 6-pack because I can drink. Okay.
Challenge accepted. All right. Next time you're in Vancouver, we're doing dinner.